There are questions that live only in the mind, and then there are questions that stir the soul. Questions that call across timelines, across buried bones and unspoken songs, across rivers that remember and trees that still hum the names of the first people who danced beneath them. What if Canada was never colonized, not as a fact to be re-engineered, but as a portal to an alternate unfolding, a mirror held to the collective what could have been, not to breed regret, but revelation? In the stillness of this question lies an entire alternate rhythm of Earth, not simply a Canada free of European flags, but a living land undisturbed by conquest, never interrupted by a foreign dream that remade rivers into borders and skin into category. It is not just about who would live here, but how life itself would flow, how language would dance, how time would spiral, how the very shape of meaning would be different. To ask this is not to fantasize, but to retrieve something ancient, the memory of a possible world where the earth was still the storyteller. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine that this great northern land, rich in breath and song, was never sliced and portioned. Imagine that the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Blackfoot wisdom, the Anishinaabe visions were allowed to evolve uninterrupted, not preserved in museums, but still sovereign in motion, not merely tolerated, but followed. A living wisdom that never needed translating because it was already fluent in earth. The winds across the tundra would speak differently in such a world. Cities may not rise as glass towers, but as living structures harmonized with the pulse of seasons. Power would not be a throne, but a circle. Wealth would not be hoarded, but circulated like stories, like ceremony. Law would not be enforced, but remembered, etched not in ink, but in rivers, in stories passed not down, but around, each speaker holding the world in their throat. And who would we be in this timeline? Not simply uncolonized Canadians, but beings shaped by entirely different myths. Our sense of self would no longer begin with ownership or achievement, but with listening, reciprocity, and presence. The ego might not inflate but dissolve, like mist over a morning lake. The concept of time may spiral instead of tick. Even the idea of nation may feel unnecessary, because when land is sacred, you don't own it, you belong to it. The idea is not to erase history, but to momentarily set it down, like removing a heavy coat we didn't realize we were wearing. For only when we release the grip of what was, can we truly feel into what could have been, and perhaps still might be. Because time, as the elders have long said, is not a line. It bends, it loops, it lives, and some doors, once imagined deeply enough, begin to open. This isn't just a political fantasy, it's a metaphysical meditation. Colonization wasn't merely the imposition of flags and governments. It was a seismic tear in the fabric of consciousness, a rupture between people and place, between heart and horizon. But what if that rupture never occurred? What would Canada be, not as a political state, but as a state of being? In the forests where treaties were never broken because they were never made, only honored, silently, we might still feel the quiet footsteps of what was almost lost. A world in which every stone had a story and no child was ever taught. They were less because of the ancestors in their blood. The spirit of the land might still be speaking fluently, rather than whispering through the cracks of asphalt and concrete, hoping someone, somewhere, remembers how to listen. To walk this alternate path, we must step beyond binary thinking. It is not them versus us, past versus future, or sorrow versus hope. It is all of it, braided together like sweetgrass, each strand holding wisdom, each twist offering resistance against the forgetfulness that colonization brought. This is not nostalgia, it is cosmological architecture, It is re-entering a blueprint where nothing is taken without ceremony, and no being is considered separate from source. So we begin not with facts and timelines, but with reverence, with the willingness to step through this invisible door, not to escape reality, but to reveal another one, running alongside it like a shadow that never left. One that asks, what if colonization never happened, not just politically, but vibrationally? What if consciousness itself was allowed to root here, undisturbed? What if Canada was never colonized, and still held the original dream of Earth intact? Welcome to the path not taken, or perhaps the path still waiting. To understand this alternate timeline is not to indulge in idle fantasy, but to unearth a deeper spiritual memory, one encoded in the bones of the land and the breath of its people. If Canada had never been colonized, the very structure of reality, as we know it in this land, would have emerged from a different foundation, one not carved from domination and division, but from sacred interconnection. Beneath every tree and cloud, there would pulse a philosophy, a way of being that was never severed from the divine rhythm of the earth. What emerges in such a timeline are not just alternative policies or borders, but alternative truths, rooted, lived, and breathed. In this reflection, we begin to feel the shape of a world built upon four invisible pillars: relationship, memory, presence, and sovereignty, not as political concepts, but as living frequencies. In the world where colonization never arrived, these four would form the natural gravity field of human life in the Northern Territories. First, relationship would be the primary logic of existence, not transaction, not possession, but sacred entanglement. Every being, from the smallest lichen to the soaring hawk, would be known as a relative. Language would reflect this. Stories would not describe the world from outside, but from within, spoken in the tongue of kinship. You wouldn't ask, "What is that?" You'd ask, "Who is that?" Because nothing would be seen as inert. There would be no such thing as natural resources, only relations honored and consulted. The second current, memory, would flow not as history written in textbooks, but as a living presence braided into ritual, song, and silence. Memory would not be linear, but circular, passed like a drumbeat, round and round, from elder to child to sky, and back again. In such a Canada, every rock would be a library, and every path through the forest a lineage. You would not learn memory, you would inhabit it, like stepping into a great river that never forgets who you are. The third, presence, would not be an accidental byproduct of mindfulness practice, but the very currency of daily life. Without the machinery of conquest, presence would not need to be reclaimed, it would be assumed. In the uncolonized world, attention would not be a luxury, it would be the most basic form of respect. To walk in the woods would not be an escape, but a counsel with the world. To speak would not be to dominate the space, but to enter a shared vibration. Time would not push you forward like a deadline. It would gather around you like a circle. And then there is sovereignty, but not the kind wrapped in legal definitions or national flags. This sovereignty would be spiritual, cellular, cosmic. It would be the knowing that each soul, each culture, each expression of life is inherently valid and self-directed. It would not require protection because it would not be under threat. It would be like a tree, rooted so deeply it cannot be moved, yet open to the sun and wind. This sovereignty would not need to scream to be heard. It would be felt in the quiet certainty of walking in one's purpose, without needing external validation. Together, these four elements, relationship, memory, presence, and sovereignty, form the gravitational field of the alternate Canada. In this place, every law would be an echo of the land's wisdom. Governance would not be imposed from above, but spoken from below, emerging organically like spring from frozen ground. Justice would not be blind, but deeply seeing. It would account not only for what was done, but for what was forgotten, for the stories left untold. In such a world, healing would not be reactive, it would be proactive, a sacred daily practice. But beyond these visible contours, there's something subtler, an essence, a hum beneath the surface. It is the recognition that colonization didn't just change the politics of land, it changed the metaphysics of the people. It introduced separation, ownership, and shame. It coded the land with an artificial hierarchy that dictated who could speak, who could own, who could lead. In the absence of colonization, the very architecture of belief would be different. Education, for instance, wouldn't begin in a classroom. It would begin in the body, in the breath, in the watching of birds, the lighting of fires, the whispering of wind through cedar. Children would learn to listen before they speak, to walk with the earth instead of on it. They would grow not to climb ladders, but to deepen roots. And religion. In this timeline, spirituality wouldn't be something separate from life. There would be no Sunday and secular divide. Every action would be ritual. Every gesture could be sacred. There would be no missionaries because there would be no spiritual emptiness to fill. The land itself would be the temple, and the stars, the stained glass. What does all this mean for those of us sitting in the now, peering through the veil into the what if? It means we are not merely imagining an alternate past, we are remembering an alternate self, a self that still exists in some dimension, humming just out of reach. And in that space, new questions begin to form. What would I be like if I had grown up in such a world? What parts of me are colonized that I've never questioned? What parts of me are still wild, unclaimed, and waiting? This journey, then, is not about rewriting history. It is about reclaiming frequency. For the alternate timeline is not gone. It is simply unchosen, and frequencies, unlike facts, are never truly erased. They linger, they echo, and sometimes when we are quiet enough, they return. To dive into the symbolic undercurrent of an uncolonized Canada is to step away from logic and into the mythic pulse beneath reality, a realm where archetype and geography, story and spirit, braid together in visions that do not merely describe, but reveal. In this place, symbols do not decorate ideas, they are the ideas. They emerge from Earth herself, whispering truths that transcend history, truths too deep for doctrine, too wild for linearity. In the alternate timeline where colonization never came, Canada's mythscape would look profoundly different. The symbolic DNA of the land, its spiritual architecture, would have unfolded unbroken, uninterrupted, unconverted. This land would still dream in the language of thunderbirds, water serpents, and tricksters. The very psyche of the people would be shaped not by cathedrals or courts, but by drumbeats echoing through pine, by stories told in the round under a dome of stars. Imagine now a creation story, passed from elder to child, to wind to fire. It is not written in books, but etched into the bones of salmon, the migration of geese, the curve of the moon. In this tale, the land itself is alive, conscious, dreaming. Long ago she gave birth to the first people, not as rulers, but as listeners. They were not given dominion, but instruction. They were taught by bear how to retreat, by wolf how to lead, by cedar how to heal. Every creature was a teacher, every stone was a witness. This wasn't mythology in the European sense, a fantasy to entertain the mind. It was cosmology, blueprint, agreement. These stories didn't just explain the world, they maintained it. They were living contracts between beings, vibrational treaties that reminded humans that they were neither above nor below the world, but of it. And then there was the sacred trickster who danced between dualities. In this Canada, the trickster would still roam freely through the stories, reminding people that wisdom does not always wear a robe of solemnity. Sometimes, truth comes disguised as laughter, as mistake, as mischief. It is this trickster, raven, nanabojo, coyote, who prevents stagnation, who dissolves ego, who makes space for transformation through paradox. In this symbolic landscape, the divine is not rigid or punitive. It is playful, shape-shifting, and endlessly creative. The presence of the thunderbird, too, would remain unshadowed. It would be more than a spirit of the sky. It would be the roaring reminder that thunder is not to be feared, but to be listened to. It would symbolize renewal, disruption, divine justice. In ceremonies, its name would still be spoken with reverence, not reduced to mascots or misunderstood murals. And beneath the rivers, the water serpent would coil still, keeper of deep emotions, protector of sacred cycles, guardian of the spaces where transformation brews in silence. Imagine a nation where these stories are not relics of the past, but the living breath of culture, where political leaders still consult with knowledge keepers, not for optics, but for alignment, where decisions are made not for profit, but for harmony with the 7 generations before and after. In such a Canada, myth is not escapism, it is navigation. It does not distance us from reality. It roots us more deeply within it, and perhaps most profound, the continued unfolding of the land itself as the ultimate sacred text. Without colonization, no need to build stone temples or carved icons. The mountain becomes the cathedral, the river becomes the scroll, the aurora borealis, a direct communion with the divine, undistorted by dogma or doctrine. Pilgrimage would be a walk through pine forests. Meditation would be sitting with the moss. Prayer would be the smoke rising from cedar, speaking the language of release. This is not to romanticize or fossilize indigenous cultures into a static paradise. The power of these symbolic systems lies not in their preservation, but in their continuity. In the uncolonized world, these stories would have evolved, yes, but they would have done so from within, not in reaction to invasion. They would remain centered, rather than forced to orbit around a dominant culture that refused to listen, and in this their mythic integrity would remain intact. But the greatest symbol of all, in this alternate timeline, is not a creature, not a story, not even a ritual. It is the circle. The circle is more than a shape. It is a world view, a relational field, a geometry of truth. In an uncolonized Canada, the circle governs all things. Decision-making would be done in circle. Justice would be administered in circle. Stories would be shared in circle. The circle holds no head, no hierarchy. It turns, it includes, it breathes. It reflects the moon, the seasons, the heartbeat. It resists the linear, the ladder, the pyramid. It reminds us that all things are connected, all things are returning, all things are becoming. This symbolic architecture, woven into the rhythms of daily life, would create a psychological, spiritual, and cultural coherence that modern society has long lost. It would offer not just meaning, but alignment, a way to be human that does not separate, consume, or conquer, but listens, receives, and gives back. To imagine this is not to wish away the present, but to anchor into an ancient wisdom that still exists beneath the concrete and the noise. These symbols are not gone, they are waiting for us to remember how to see, how to hear, how to read the land again as text. To understand once more that the map to a better world is not in policy documents or political platforms, but in dreams, stories, symbols, and sacred geometry. The alternate timeline whispers not just from the past, but from the depths of our being, and in its whisper is an invitation. What if we still walked in circle? What if we still listened to Thunderbird? What if the trickster still guided us home? It is one thing to wander through the realm of the symbolic, to touch the shape of an uncolonized Canada as if brushing the edge of a dream. But what does it mean to live that vision, now, here in the bones of this current world? The alternate timeline is not merely a fable to stir the imagination. It is a mirror, a reflection of latent possibilities dormant within the collective psyche. The deeper question we must now ask is not just what if, but what now? How do we take the frequency of that unbroken reality and integrate it into fractured lives? colonized minds, and systemized societies. We begin where all true transformation begins, not with revolution, but with relationship. Relationship to land, to body, to language, to each other. If in the alternate world everything is kin, then our first act of reclamation must be to re-enter this field of kinship. It is a quiet act, radical in its subtlety. It happens when we greet the land not as backdrop but as being, when we speak to water before we drink, when we stop labeling trees as resources and begin again to see them as elders. This shift does not require permission, it requires presence, and presence does not require a title or a ceremony. It requires willingness, the willingness to slow down and sense, to listen not just with ears, but with skin, with breath. In doing so, we begin to exit the colonized relationship to time and enter the circular pulse of the Earth's rhythm. In this spiral of time, healing is not linear. Awakening is not a peak, it is a return. Language, too, is a threshold. Every colonized mind carries with it a colonized tongue, words born of empire, built to dominate, categorize, and control. To integrate the alternate timeline into this moment is to begin honoring the return of indigenous languages, not as a cultural gesture, but as a spiritual necessity. These are not just dialects, they are codes. Each language carries its own worldview, its own instructions for living well on the earth. To hear an elder speak in their native tongue is to hear the earth remember itself, and in that remembering, we are reassembled. But real-world implications stretch further. The systems we live within, education, law, economy, are all scaffolds born of colonial logic. And while we may not yet have the power to dismantle them entirely, we can begin to subvert them from within. What would it look like for school curriculums to center indigenous cosmologies, not as units in a textbook, but as foundational frameworks for understanding reality? What would governance look like if it took its cues from the circle, from consensus, from ceremony? We are not without maps. Across the country, indigenous communities are already leading the way, not just in resisting erasure, but in rebuilding reality, restoring traditional governance, reviving ancestral agricultural practices, rewilding sacred sites, speaking languages once forbidden. In many places, these are not acts of nostalgia, they are acts of future-making. They are not echoes of the past, they are seeds of a parallel present. And we, who are settlers or descendants of settlers, we are not excluded from this integration, but we must arrive with humility, not as saviors, not as guests overstaying their welcome, but as humans willing to listen deeply and unlearn radically. The uncolonized timeline does not ask for guilt, it asks for responsibility, a willingness to dismantle internalized supremacy, a readiness to move from allyship to kinship, an openness to the idea that we are all, in some way, in recovery from disconnection, from forgetting, from illusion. Economically, this alternate vision challenges everything. It confronts the extractive heart of modern capitalism. In the uncolonized Canada, wealth is relational, not accumulative. Abundance is measured not in ownership, but in balance. To live this truth now means learning to ask not what can I take, but what can I tend? It means shifting from consumption to contribution, from exploitation to exchange, from ownership to stewardship. And the environment, this is perhaps the most tangible frontier for re-entry into the alternate timeline. Without colonization, the ecosystems of Canada would have remained intact, not as pristine landscapes frozen in time, but as evolving, co-created webs of life maintained through reciprocal relationship. Reclaiming this now means not just protecting the earth as a resource, but recognizing her as primary intelligence. It means restoring not only land, but our ability to hear land, to follow its wisdom, to co-evolve. On a personal level, integration happens in the daily rituals we often overlook. Drinking water with gratitude, walking with awareness, speaking less, listening more, unlearning urgency, reclaiming joy as resistance, choosing stories that heal over stories that divide, honoring our ancestors, both those who upheld life and those who caused harm by doing better. Ultimately, to live this alternate Canada is to begin seeing that the real world is not the only world, that beneath the asphalt, the old songs still vibrate, that within the systems, the soul still stirs, that this vision is not an escape, it is a return, not to the past, but to a timeline that has always been running parallel, waiting for us to step into its current. The integration is not perfect, and it does not need to be. It begins with a single act of remembering, a gesture, a word, a circle drawn in the dirt. And maybe that's the greatest teaching of the alternate Canada, that the sacred is not far away. It is here, it is now, it is within. There is a stillness that falls over the land just before the snow begins, a hush, a sacred pause. In this silence, you can hear something deeper than sound, a memory, or maybe a possibility, whispering through the pines, carried by the wind over lakes older than the stars. That is where this alternate Canada lives, not in textbooks, not in timelines, but in that quiet echo that says, it didn't have to be this way, and it still doesn't. This vision we've journeyed through, of a Canada uncolonized, is more than thought experiment or historical revision. It is a living current, a timeline that exists beyond the reach of empire, unbothered by conquest, untouched by flags. And though we may have been born into a different current, this one still flows alongside us, offering an invitation, not to escape history, but to complete it, to fulfill the promise of this land, not through domination, but through remembering, through return. Return does not mean regression. It is not a desire to undo the present, nor is it a denial of the complexity of now. It is a spiral motion, one that loops backward, only to leap forward, with deeper roots and wider vision. It asks not for blame, but for courage. The courage to unlearn what we've called progress. The courage to measure success, not by GDP or infrastructure, but by harmony, humility, and wholeness. The dream of an uncolonized Canada is not about nostalgia. It is about potential, a potential that still flickers in the hearts of Indigenous communities who carry the ancient codes, in forests that remember the ceremonies once danced beneath them, and in people, settler and Indigenous alike, who feel the ache of something missing they cannot name. This vision is not locked away. It does not belong to the past. It is encoded in the water, in the stars, in the bones of the buffalo. It is carried in languages that are not lost, but sleeping. It is guarded by grandmothers who never stop praying. And it is pulsing inside you, right now, reading these words, wondering what to do next. So what do we do next? We begin, not perfectly, not with certainty, but with reverence. We begin with a gesture, small, sincere. We begin by asking different questions, not how do I fix this, but how can I listen more deeply? Not what can I teach, but what can I remember? Not who has power, but how can I give mine back? We begin by stepping into circle, real or symbolic, and letting ourselves be undone by stories that were never written for us, but were always about us. We begin by dreaming together, not of another empire, but of a shared earth. We begin by honoring grief, not to drown in it, but to cleanse through it. Grief for what was taken, grief for what was forgotten, grief for the ancestors who were silenced and the ones who stayed silent, but also gratitude. Gratitude for the ones who remembered, who kept the songs, who kept the fire, and through that fire, a new light begins to burn. You do not need to wait for a better system. You are the system, dreaming itself awake. The question is not whether you can walk this alternate path. The question is whether you'll recognize it when it appears, not as a headline or a movement, but as a whisper, a drumbeat, a sudden tear in the veil that lets in the sun. Because the truth is, this alternate Canada is not separate from this one. It is folded within it, like a seed within soil. All it needs is breath, intention, the willingness to water it. And so I leave you not with an answer, but with a call to imagine more wildly, to live more consciously, to decolonize, not just your politics, but your perception, to walk forward, not as a citizen of a state, but as a being of the land, to understand that real change will not come from above, but from within. Remember, the dream is not over, it is becoming. Encircled has not been broken, only paused. And now, you are being asked to take your place within it, not as a guest, not as a savior, but as a soul returning to the song. Let the dream awaken through you. Let the land speak again. Let the future remember that we tried. And may we together choose the timeline where the earth still dreams of wholeness, and we become the ones who make it real.